we can leverage plant chemicals for our own health and wellness, but even more of those fungal chemicals are even more bioavailable to our body because they are part of our evolution.
Buckle up, let's go. Tero Isokauppila, I'm so excited to welcome you to the Better Podcast. Welcome.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, and we were just talking. We have lots of mutual friends, and I have been consuming your product, some of the mushroom coffees at Four Sigmatic for many years. So this is I'm really excited to have you on. We're going to be talking a lot about some of the energetic and healing and adaptogenic properties that many mushrooms have. Before we do that, though, I thought it would be, setting the stage to really understand why we should be listening to you. I know that you are a 13th generation farmer. Talk to us a little bit about your upbringing. I know mom and dad had very different, we'll say careers, but I think both of those were very instrumental in shaping who you are today and your understanding of the lay of the land and mushrooms and adaptogens in general.
Yeah, of course. So I grew up in Finland, which is a small country in Northern Europe. Funny enough, now very trendy, both for tourism, but also voted, I believe, 4 times in a row, the happiest country in the world, which is always hilarious to us Finns. And I grew up on a farm. So my parents are the 12th generation. Me and my brother are the 13th. We now manage the farm. And then our kids will be the 14th. And my dad is an agronomist, which is a fancy way of saying he's a professional farmer. So he's educated farmer, and he is obsessed with trees and soil. And that gave me a lot of the applied version of food and agriculture. And then my mom taught physiology and anatomy to nurses. So she had more of the science. Weirdly enough, my dad is very conventional, and my mom was always more open to the holistic and progressive. Then I studied chemistry and nutrition. I randomly discovered a rare mushroom 15 years ago and won an innovation award for it, and have spent about 20 years.
You discovered a rare mushroom?
Yeah. It's a long story by itself, but me and a friend of mine won this innovation award for discovering this species that was only it's a subspecies of one of the most expensive foods in the world. It's kind of it's a mushroom species. It's kind of like the truffle for the Japanese. That was only thought to grow in Hokkaido, which is the northern part of Japan. And then the species has a sister species growing up in where I grew up. And then we won this innovation award for it. But yeah, about 20 years working with adaptogens, 10 years I've been running a company called Four Sigmatic, which is, trying to educate and distribute these functional mushrooms and adaptogens to the world.
I love that. So talk to us a little bit about the history, maybe in the evolution of humans and mushrooms. Because one of the things I find most interesting is that we have receptors in the brain, and we have receptors throughout the body for mushrooms. So whether you're looking to take medicinal mushrooms, or we might get into psychedelics today as well. Those all you can have profound impacts through the body, and even in protected areas, like neurologically protected areas like the brain. So talk to us a little bit about how humans and mushrooms have co-evolved together over you don't have to do the whole history, but a general overview of how we've evolved together.
Yeah, that's actually a great question, because it sets the stage for a lot of things that we already know, but also potentially future research that is about to be unlocked, both with psychedelics and these healthy functional mushrooms. So, the world is, call it 4.5 billion years old. We've been here 100, maybe 200,000 years as is the current version of Homo sapiens. The fungi have been around for 2.4 billion years at least. So they were the first thing to come out of the ocean to the dry land. And they are similar to fungi, and animals actually share ancestry. And there's a lot of similarities where we're much closer to fungi, all animal species, than we are to plants. So fungi, for example, need to breathe oxygen and expel CO2. Plants are the opposite. But another interesting thing is fungi need to get their own external food. They can't produce photosynthesis like plants. So there was no food on the planet, so they would digest rocks for the first over a billion years. So they use enzymes to break down things. And this will be relevant as we go on. So, but because of the similar ancestry, so fungi is its own kingdom, maybe taking one step back. So there's plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, and then various single cell creatures. And often in health and wellness, we forget bacteria and fungi, and they have kind of had this discrimination as we've battled if we should eat plants or animals. But actually where you find bacteria is where you find fungi. And both of these kingdoms cohabit us. So there's bacteria and fungi on our skin, on our gut. So besides the microbiome, there's a microbiome. And because of this history and DNA similarity, we're very prone to fungal diseases. So that's the negative. But then fungal medicine or healing properties and compounds are very bioavailable to us because they're so familiar. So we can leverage plant chemicals for our own health and wellness, but even more of those fungal chemicals are even more, call it bioavailable for lack of a broad word, to our body because they are part of our evolution.
I love that. And there are some, and we'll get into lion's mane and some of the other ones in a moment, but there are some compounds in some of these mushrooms that can cross, let's say, neurologically protective sites, like, the blood-brain barrier, for example, where it is incredibly difficult. And just for context for the listener, and of course I have a very educated audience, so some of you already know this, but the blood-brain barrier is basically the brain's way of, having, let's say, bouncers at the gate. Like it only lets a couple of things in. So we have, heroin and, opioids, for example, can cross the blood-brain barrier, but very few medications, very, very few medications can actually cross the blood-brain barrier, which has made some of the, we'll say, research and, finding the cure for some of these brain-based diseases, Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, Huntington's disease, et cetera, incredibly difficult. So I think that it's very interesting that we have natural compounds that exist, let's say in lion's mane and in others, that can very easily cross the blood-brain barrier. And it makes you think, like, is there, why is that? Why do those specific compounds have that ability?
Yeah. So you're spot on. So the body has multiple layers of protection. One of the most hardest layers is the blood-brain barrier, and it's to avoid toxins to go to our brain because it would be lethal. So there's an evolutionary purpose why very few things can cross it, glucose and certain things. Negative is it's hard to get nutrients to the brain. So therefore, often not having the right nutrients in the brain could lead over decades or multiple decades into these illnesses. And by the time you have the symptoms, it's often very difficult to do anything because you're so far behind the A curve. So why is it that fungi such as lion's mane have the ability to penetrate the blood-brain barrier and then help repair and protect nerve growth factors in these myelin sheaths? The short answer is nobody knows. There are theories. There's theories of panspermia, of actually life coming to Earth because these fungi were found in space. So things can grow in space. We now know that. So that's one theory. Other theories is these cohabitant theories of basically have been, as long as we've been Homo sapiens, we've also been part fungi. So there's these theories of coexistence, but nobody really knows, me included. I have no clue why certain fungi, and that makes it fun to constantly learn and figure out more about our body and the brain specifically. If we look at the history of physiology and anatomy studies, it was very organ and muscle centric, right? It was for a long time. And the nervous system and the brain. So if the body has 11 systems, and you cover a lot of these systems in this podcast, they're the underlying principles, be it reproductive system or digestive system. And happens to be that the nervous system and the brain are the areas where there was just so much less research. And it was really not until the 90s was really the first real decade of the brain. And we're still in very early stages of figuring these things out. And for many of these things, we don't have answers today. But yeah, lion's mane is is one of these compounds that are able to penetrate the blood-brain barrier.
All right. Well, let's kind of continue wading into the waters of mushrooms. So let's actually distinguish first. Like you've mentioned, functional mushrooms. We've talked about psychedelics. What is the difference between, let's say, a culinary mushroom, something that you might find in a grocery store, so like a portobello or a white button or, a shiitake or something, versus what we're talking, like, why can't you find, maybe some stores you can now, but why couldn't you, let's say, find chopped up lion's mane or chopped up, chaga or something like that? Why can't you find some of those compounds versus the culinary mushroom kingdom? Can you distinguish between those two?
Yeah. So first of all, it's a huge kingdom. A lot of the fungal species are even invisible. So they're in the air as we breathe them. Yeasts are part of fungi. So there's a lot of like how you make beer, wine, bread, cheese, all fermented products, sauerkraut. So, they all have this fungal element. But from this mushroom, which is the fruiting body, the toadstool usually shaped form of fungi, there are culinary mushrooms, functional mushrooms, and psychedelic mushrooms. And these are the ones that you could use. There's obviously the ones that don't fall into any of these threes, but you're probably at least likely to consume them. So the culinary mushrooms, such as a portobello, are used mostly for flavor. They do have fiber, some macro and some micronutrients, but in limited capacity. This is why they're often mixed with vegetables, even though from a biology point of view, they're nothing to do with vegetables. But the health benefits are somewhat similar. They're usually easy to cultivate and they're used for nutrients. And then the functional mushrooms tend to be growing on trees. So versus the culinary mushrooms tend to grow on the ground, or more commonly are like easily cultivated on other mediums, versus some of the best functional mushrooms grow in the wild or in trees, and they're harder. They're not all of them, because there's an overlap, like shiitake is kind of both, but a lot of them are inedible, meaning that they are not edible raw, but you have to like prepare them into a tea or broth, and you can't just easily slice and dice them.
You can't just chop them up and stir fry them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then both of these are completely legal and safe to use. The other one is more for flavor in the culinary, and the functional is more for health and wellness benefits. So that's I would say the big difference.
So what about the mushrooms that grow on my lawn? What should I be doing with those?
Unlikely you should eat them for a few reasons. So first of all, even if you take the best identification expert, so there's people who just focus on identifying fungi. First of all, they can identify 1 or 2% of all the fungi in the world, the best person. Wow. Secondly, they need to put it in a lab and do a spore print to know what that is. So that purely by looking at it, you rarely see it, what it is. And then third, fungi tend to accumulate or even hyperaccumulate toxins. So I don't know what's on your lawn or what's your neighbor's lawn, but like generally, I wouldn't encourage anybody to eat these mushrooms growing on your yard. They're not dangerous for the lawn, but I wouldn't recommend you ever eating them.
Right. Awesome. Okay. Good tip. Don't eat the stuff on your lawn.
No.
All right. So let's actually talk about so you're in your book, Healing Adaptogens, you go through mushrooms, you go through all sorts of tinctures and how to prepare different types of adaptogens. And I think that this word adaptogen is used, what's the word I want to say? It's more of a general, I think that it's been used so much that it's we're not really understanding what the actual intent of the original use of the word is. So why don't we start with what makes an adaptogen an adaptogen? What are some of the properties that the compound has to have in order to be considered an adaptogen?
Great. So those are natural substances, so usually plants and fungi, that help balance and protect you from stress. There's 3 requirements, and it's easier to explain the requirements by telling a short story. So a lot of these compounds that are adaptogens have been used for hundreds of or thousands of years, but the name adaptogen comes from the Soviet Union about 7 years ago, where the Soviet army was trying to figure out what can we give to soldiers besides amphetamines and other drugs to boost performance that wouldn't have the letdown or the addictive properties. I, for example, had to be in the Finnish Air Force, and even we got given, I was morphine and stuff like that. So like militaries have been liberal with very addictive compounds in the course of history and today. So this doctor, Dr. Lazarov, and gathered a group of scientists to study what could help boost performance, cognitive, physical, stamina, recovery without the letdown next day, and came up with 3 requirements that all adaptogens should cover. They sound very simple, but only 2 or 3 dozen of foods today we know qualifies. One is that they're safe on every day in a non-toxic way. So a lot of the best herbs we can eat are actually seasonal. So the dandelions, the garlics, the wild hops, they're all amazing, but they're not meant to be had. And there's actually a toxic load that you start to build. Very few things don't have a toxic load. Now, dietary fiber doesn't have a toxic load, but it doesn't qualify the next 2 things that adaptogens need to have. One is that they restore balance. So a lot of focus in nutrition and health and wellness has been on macro and micronutrients, on organs. And I think what we're more and more realizing, like you podcast often well highlights, is these nano compounds and compounds that impact underlying systems like the endocrine system, for example, and how big of a multiplying effect the healthy endocrine system has to energy production, circulatory system, and so on and so forth. So like what these adaptogens do is they have to restore balance in these body systems. Systemically instead of like a sniper rifle. So really these adaptogens don't do anything like, hey, improve brain power. But what they do is they restore balance in systems, which increases performance. And we can talk about that in detail, how that actually works. But the third, so it's safe and it's these systems. And then third is that they're non-specific, which is sometimes quite hard for people to understand. But the same product that can be used for energy can be used for recovery. Ashwagandha might be one example that many people have heard, or turmeric. That can be used in the morning as you're trying to get energy and productivity, but that could also be used in the evening to lower inflammation and sleep better. So that's like, those are examples of products that have this very usually products are labeled as an upper or downer, but adaptogens are neither, or more preferably both. So
I love that. And I've noticed that as well. Like, so I've used ashwagandha. I was first introduced to it as a stress, to help with reducing stress. But I've also noticed that it kind of, whenever you're using any type of adaptogen, so turmeric you mentioned, so I want to, maybe we can, pause on turmeric and ashwagandha. It sort of gives you what you need in the moment. So ashwagandha, when I've had it in the morning, I've actually felt like, oh, I feel like I have a little bit, like it's almost warming, if you will, or it's energizing to me, as you mentioned. But it also can be taken with a concoction, let's say with cacao or something, in the evening as something that will help calm you down, which I think is there's no medicine that has ever, to my knowledge anyway, that is able to sort of get into the body and figure out what it is that the body needs once it's there, so I think there's something really cool about that.
A couple really quick examples. One of these adaptogens is cordyceps, and cordyceps has been proven to increase VO2 max, so how much oxygen can you take, and your ATP production, so technically this cellular energy. So imagine like you being at whatever situation you are, stressed or busy or whatever, and by having more oxygen in your lungs, you have better circulation, more energy. And that's it's like a positive circle that happens. Similarly, like a compound like ashwagandha or reishi that helps with the endocrine system, particularly like a lot of the studies are on like HPA axis and the adrenals and stress response. Maybe that allows you to reach 15, 20 minutes more deep sleep. And then that 15 minutes of more deep sleep then compounds tomorrow into something else. So they're much more holistic and regenerative than many other solutions. Some of them offer fast results, but they are more of like long-term partners in performance.
And when we're classifying an adaptogen as a whole, is there any habituation that can take place? So for example, we know that when you take, let's say, hormones, for example, people who are doping or people who are even just taking hormone replacement therapy, sometimes there needs to be sort of like a backing off of or a break to it so that the endocrine system, for example, doesn't habituate to it. We see this with type 2 diabetics as well. They just habituate to the insulin dose, right? So they keep necessitating a higher and higher level of insulin as time goes on. Do we see that habituation effect with adaptogens? Are they safe for the most part? I'm sure there's going to be outliers, but are they safe for the most part to take every day?
Yes. And that is actually really difficult and really rare. So you would think but a lot of the best things we do actually are not okay on a daily basis. But adaptogens are. So I would say there's like 20 something of these adaptogens that have actually modern research. Maybe there's another 20 that we haven't yet researched enough, but like there isn't that many things that are safe to take, but they are. And it does help you in kind of like having confidence on using them, knowing that there isn't like a toxic load the same way as many other herbs that are otherwise good for you. Yeah. Or hormonal replacement therapy.
Right. Okay, let's come back to cordyceps because I was saying to you in the pre-chat, I want to talk about this because this is a very interesting, I don't want to say scary, that's not the right word, but it's almost like a parasitic fungi, right? It's almost like a predatory almost type of fungi. So can you explain to us a little bit about cordyceps in the wild? And then you mentioned the VO2 max. When we're thinking about augmenting performance, I wanted to talk about cordyceps. We can also talk about ginseng and lion's mane kind of in this conversation together. But what would be would you preload it before a workout? Would you take it after the workout? Like what is the best way, based on maybe it's based on your goal or your age or your gender or something, but what is the best way to be thinking about cordyceps?
Yeah. Cordyceps is a parasitic fungi, which sounds scary. It's actually do. And there is even a BBC documentary about cordyceps fungi taking over these bullet ants and basically controlling them. So it's gone viral many times. And I think some people might have seen it. It's super safe for humans, but it was discovered in the Himalayas by the Sherpas by observing the yaks, which are the large mammals carrying a lot of goods, were really tired after walking in the high altitude. And then they start grazing on this fungi that grows out of different kinds of like larvae and whatnot in the high altitude. And suddenly they had all this energy and sex drive. So one of the nicknames of cordyceps is cordycex, because of this, like libido impacting effects.
And then the Sherpas would take it themselves and notice the same things, right? So they saw it in the animal study, right? And then they did it in the human study and they noticed themselves.
So there's a lot of amazing stories like this around the world. Happens to be that the Indians and the Chinese were the best at documenting, and the Amazon was probably the least good at documenting some of these stories. But a lot of the original discoveries were like that, like observing animals, observing nature, and then having the courage to try it yourself. And then it works on. For many, many centuries, people used it. And then later, it's obviously gained a lot of modern research. But how and when to take it is particularly for sports exercise. There's kind of two kinds of benefits, which is actually a good segue to talk about nutrition in general. Is like people are like, hey, how long should I take, vitamin D? How long should I take this and that? I would more look at it as what part of your body are you trying to expect to get results, and how quickly does those cells replenish? So let's just say skin. You want a better skin. Your skin takes, depending on age, genetics, yada, 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 about 30 days to heal. So any routine that is under 30 days seems a little weird to get benefits, right? Moisture level might be the one exception there. But then if you look at energy production, it's really fast. So people who are looking for the ATP production benefits of a little bit like caffeine-free boost, then pre-workout makes tons of sense. So like having 500 to 1500 milligrams of cordyceps extract pre-workout, whatever you would take
for an aerobic type of workout.
No, actually for energy, any type of workout. Okay. So the other part is the VO2 max, which is slightly will take longer based on studies. But to reap the VO2 max benefits, you probably have to be on cordyceps for weeks, if not a month or more, to start accumulating some of those VO2 max benefits. Your lungs will not react as fast as your mitochondria. So again, like let's assume you have spine health issues or brain issues or gut issues, you'd have to know that those systems take months, if not years, to heal. So if you have issues with those systems, you need to have a protocol that you can maintain for multiple years sustainably, versus if you're trying to heal a system that is much faster at reaction, muscular system or circulatory system, you can get benefits today, tomorrow, in a week. So I think sometimes I hear like, how long should I take this supplement? I would almost ask, what is the desired effect that you're trying to get? And that would tell you how long the protocol is. And also, like, if you have gut issues, you should build a sustainable system that you are able to maintain for many months, if not years, to truly heal your gut if you have serious gut issues. So
I love that you're saying this, because I think that I get this question a lot as it pertains to weight loss and balancing hormones and women in, let's say, perimenopause and menopause. And it's like, what supplement should I take? How long do I need to take this for? And it's like, well, you're asking the wrong question. It's not what supplement I'm going to take or how long. It's like, who do I need to become in order to have the nutrition routine, let's say, or the supplement routine or the exercise routine that's going to yield the best results over the long term? Because I would assume that anyone who's even if you're not in perimenopause, even if you're in your 30s and you're listening to the show and you're like, I just want to live my best life. Your life isn't 6 weeks. Your life isn't 6 months. It's not a year. We want to be playing the long game. We want to be thinking about how these things can be spread out over the, you wouldn't just, and this is kind of the example that I give to sort of drive this point home, is like, you wouldn't exercise for a week, or you wouldn't get on the treadmill or go for a walk, let's say, and be like, there, that's it. I did it. I'm fit. It's something that needs to be done over and over again, in the same way that you wouldn't eat a salad or, whatever constitutes a healthy meal for you and say, there it is. I had my healthy meal. I'm now healthy. It's something that has to be there has to be a continuous exposure to that stimulus in order to reap the response that you're looking for.
100%. And let's take the same exercise. Why are you exercising? If your goal is to become stronger or build stronger bones, that's going to take months, if not years, to achieve those results. If your goal is reduce acute stress because you got a bad email or you had a fight with your partner or whatever, and you go for a walk or run, you will reap benefits within 10, 15 minutes probably, because like the same exercise that helps you against osteoporosis versus acute stress at home acts different pace, because the body systems are either faster or slower to give you the desired result. So for exercise, for cordyceps that is looking for pick me up, more energy at any type of workout, pre-workout is fine. If your goal is to have higher, particularly cardiovascular response and performance at higher heart rates, in that case, you probably need to have it for a few weeks, and kind of any time of the day, it accumulates and builds up in your body.
So 500 to 1500 milligrams, you're saying?
Yeah, I would say
daily. Yeah.
And this is somewhat true for all of these adaptogens, is like you need to have them in some sort of extracted form. So they are not bioavailable by themselves. So there's this concept of xenohormesis, where these plants or fungi have built these active biocompounds for themselves. They don't do it for us. They do it for themselves to protect against their stress. Therefore, a lot of these adaptogens grow in extreme environments. You mentioned maca. Earlier, we talked about how it grows in altitude. Cordyceps grows in altitude, ashwagandha, rhodiola in the tundras. And they build these compounds, but they are protected. So usually hot water, lipids, or some ways to unlock it. And then probably any product you see on the market that promotes it has 70, 80 adaptogens or whatever superfoods has none, because just the amount that you would have to consume are much higher. So one scoop of some miracle powder that has 80 of these things is unlikely to give you an effective dose based on the modern research. So for my latest book, we went through like 1,000 research papers, and it's pretty consistent that there's slight variations in dosages between adaptogens, but it is some hundreds of milligrams per adaptogen in extracted form to reap benefits. So, yeah.
Great. So Cordyceps is for any type of performance enhancing activity that you want to do. When we're trying to distinguish between, let's say, aerobic or anaerobic, because I know that there's going to be, well, for example, when we're lifting weights, sometimes we can, depending on the intensity, you can absolutely move into anaerobic system. So are there other adaptogens that you might recommend, let's say pre or post, for lifting weights and or cardio?
Yeah, no, the anaerobic exercise, I want to say recovery time is pretty big. So even if, let's assume you're doing 5x5 heavy duty, heavy lifting type of workouts with 3 to 5 minutes between those sets, still the impact of recovery is a factor. So I would absolutely encourage even people on anaerobic exercises to look into things that improve recovery times. Other very famous things, pre-workout is rhodiola. It was used by my ancestors, Vikings, before going to battle. It's also used for cognitive support. It's one of the few supplements European Union has said that it's like a natural product that actually increases cognitive function, but it has a compound rosavin that improves performance. Schisandra, which is known in a lot of beauty products, but the original research is actually on a lot of it was one of the original Soviet adaptogens. It increases performance. So Schisandra, rhodiola, cordyceps, those are some of the things. More and more people are using lion's mane for pre-workout as well for nervous system. So there are people who are worried about nervous system damage or the impact of exercise on the nervous system, especially if it's like, plyometrics or sprinting. And so there's more and more people using that. There isn't as much modern research on that, but I think it's a fascinating concept of using lion's mane with your pro-workout. Post-workout, there is turmeric, reishi, chaga. Immunity is actually inflammation and immunity would be the factors post-workout that you want to be most acutely aware of, is lowering inflammation and then protecting against getting sick. Everybody who's exercised a long time know that one of the biggest problems you have is once you get sick, you have major setbacks. You've made great progress. You're in a row. Then you get sick, can't work out, and then you fall behind, and it's very demotivating. So immunity, actually post-workout, is one of the most important factors to consider that I feel like a lot of athletes or active people ignore.
I agree. And I think if you look at any type of exercise, irrespective of, intensity, duration, frequency, if you look at exercise in general, we see during exercise, we see blood pressure rising, we see atrial fibrillations, we see the immune system tank, we see attenuation in thyroid function. Like, it actually looks very scary acutely, right? We actually look much more worn down. And to your point, from an immunological perspective, we are much more vulnerable immediately after the workout. It's almost like, I don't think this is a fair comparison. I was going to say it's almost like when we have a high bolus of sugar, we actually see about 2 to 6 hours post consumption, we actually see an attenuation in T cell activity and macrophage activity, et cetera. Now, I don't think that those two stimuli are the same, but it is similar in that post exercise, we are much more vulnerable to viral or bacterial infection, let's say. And anybody who works out regularly knows that getting sick is the absolute worst. It is the worst. And what I was going to ask you, and I think I might be doing this wrong, but I like to take lion's mane after my workout. And I know that it has sort of brain boosting effects. It helps with concentration. And I actually sometimes I had it this morning before I knew we were going to be getting on this show together, so that I know that my power of vocabulary and my focus and concentration is is on point, but I actually like to take it right after my workout as well. I mean, one of the sort of maybe lesser known benefits to it is, again, with immunity. And I wondered if you could speak to that.
Yeah, actually, I also take it afterwards. We have Four Sigmatic has a protein powder that has five of these mushrooms and two additional adaptogens, and I take it partly for immunity because lion's mane has those benefits, and partly because I feel like it's interesting the potential of the nervous system recovery factor. But obviously, again, that's not quite well studied yet. So yeah, it makes total sense. And as far as the shock goes, or be it sugar or exercise, it puts the body in pressure. I just find it fascinating that people don't talk about immunity post-workout almost at all. And at the same time, think of the situation. You're drenched in sweat. Some people in AC, like sometimes very strong air conditioning. And then you're sitting because you're so tired. You have this euphoria. So you're just sitting in the sweat, recovering for a while and then changing. And I feel like those are risky times to easily get sick. And depending where you work out and how you work out, maybe there's other people who are in the same situation. So bacteria and virus have a good breeding block. So I would encourage people who work out actively and regularly to consider immune support post-workout as a critical way to stay healthy.
Let's continue the immune conversation a little bit more with chaga. In your book, you were talking about a study with I believe it was cancer patients, and they were given I believe the number was 6 milligrams of chaga per kilogram of body weight, so 6 mg per kg, and then after I want to say 3 weeks, 4 weeks of taking that specific dosage of chaga, they looked at the tumors again, and they were reduced by up to 60%. Now, cancer is a very broad conversation. It is a separate conversation, an entirely separate conversation, because it is so multifaceted in terms of its etiology. There's a metabolic component. Absolutely, there is a immunological component. There's also genetic components and environment and all the things. But let's talk a little bit about chaga and the ability, we'll say, just with our conversation around immunity, inducing cell apoptosis and the abundant antioxidants that it has. Talk a little bit about chaga and why that is a superfood that we should be considering, maybe post-workout or just as a general tonic.
Yeah, cancer, like you said, is a complex topic, and I have to dance around it because, as an author, I can have freedom of speech, but as a CEO of
you're not claiming company, anything here.
Yeah,
anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's a real dance to be had. My dad had cancer a few years ago, luckily now fully healed. And it was interesting to also see the whole cancer industry and their reaction to lifestyle and food is so resistant. Like, it's like literally
it's not even a factor. They don't seem to really care.
I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but my dad had a very specific cancer, and there's a very famous cancer hospital here in the United States that had the leading researcher for that cancer type. And we were doing consulting with him or her on what he should take. And it was interesting. I was like, so what about diet and lifestyle? And said the leading researcher was like, it literally doesn't matter. And it's like, so beer and bread are the same as, bone broth and,
chaga.
And it's like, yeah, it doesn't matter at all. I was like,
wow.
I mean, that's an extreme position to take, that lifestyle doesn't matter. Okay, so back to chaga. It's near and dear to me. It grows in Finland. The very first book written in the Finnish language included chaga and mentioned it for health and immunity purpose. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which is a Nobel-winning author, also mentioned it in book for immunity. So it has a lot of history. And my ancestors used it as a coffee substitute during Second World War. So Finns actually sneakily drink more coffee than anyone else in the world, almost 3 times more than Americans. And when we were attacked both by the Germans and the Russians, we ran out of coffee beans and people drank it. And after the war, University of Helsinki has done tons of studies on it. And the cancer aside, it has very abundant amount of antioxidants, particularly certain types of black color pigments. Usually, as a good rule of thumb, these black compounds in cacao, coffee, black sesame seeds, black olives, chaga are pretty good for longevity. More specifically, chaga is the highest in melanin, which gives it a black color, and superoxidase dismutase, which is, one of these master antioxidants. So what does that lead to? It leads to, lower inflammation, natural kill cell activity. So these are like reactions of it. But I think the fascinating part about chaga is that it's immunomodulatory. So a lot of things you take for immune system, echinacea, garlic, are stimulants. And especially people who have already overactive immune response, for example, someone with an autoimmune, they get triggered by immunostimulants because their immune system is already confused. So what's cool about chaga is the immunomodulatory benefit of not being immunosuppressant or immunostimulant, but instead of immunomodulatory and modulating the immune response. So I think that's, for immune system, pretty interesting concept.
Well, that kind of comes back to what we were talking about, sort of giving the compound gives you what you need. If you have, let's say you have Hashimoto's thyroiditis or lupus or multiple sclerosis or whatever, where often I'll say clinically, I've noticed specifically with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, because I work with a lot of women that have either hypothyroid, which basically means they have early Hashis, or it's like full-blown Hashimoto's. We often find that there are liver conversion issues of T4 to 3. We find that there's gut issues, like they have hyperpermeability of the barrier, so that leaky gut that is kind of become, we'll say the layman, that's sort of what it's called publicly, but it's like basically hyper permeability of the intestinal wall, and then of course dysbiosis. So we have you talked about the mycobacterium, and we know that bacteria and fungi, they compete for the same food sources, right? So if you have an overgrowth of, we'll say, opportunistic bacteria, then that's also going to fight off let's say fungi as well, because they're competing for the same they're competing for the same sugar and food sources as well.
And I add one thing on that is you brought up multiple sclerosis, and we talked about cordyceps before. It is like kind of an uncurable disease, but the one officially FDA approved cure is made by Novartis, and it's called Gilenya, and it's made out of cordyceps. So the only official drug for MS is based on cordyceps. So I think there's some of these breadcrumbs to follow also on how they work on our immune system.
And would you, if you had someone, let's say, that had MS and they were on this particular drug, would you counsel them to also take cordyceps or suggest that, or?
I believe that's one of those questions where I'm not allowed to answer because that's direct medical advice. Yeah. Okay. But I think it's interesting, and I think there's an increasing amount of the MS community that are opening up to the lifestyle, particularly because they've been so crippled by it. And I think it's true for a lot of the autoimmune community, Hashimoto's and others included. So I think people are waking up to lifestyle implications and diet.
And what is the proposed mechanism of action with cordyceps? Like, what is this? So we talked about VO2 performance, we talked about mitochondria, we talked about lung performance. What is there any sort of thinking around what might be helping the dysregulated immune system?
It's the immunomodulatory benefit also with cordyceps. So it's technically calming down the immune response or directing it to be more precise. So one way to look at it is that your gut will have fungi anyway, you want it or not. It depends on the quality of the fungi, and then that quality of the fungi impacts your immune response. And in the case of most autoimmune disorders, the immune response has gotten confused, where it doesn't know who's an intruder and who's not, and then it has these flare-ups, or that's another common term that I hear. And in this case, the polysaccharides, particularly the beta-declucans and the chagas and the cordyceps, they are like a boot camp for the macrophages. And so they're like I mentioned this word xenohormesis, which is pretty much exclusively used for plants, but it's kind of accurate for fungi as well. But basically is that these plants have created these compounds, these stressors. By facing stress themselves, they created compounds that when we ingest, we actually get slight amounts of stress. So it's
xenos is other from Greek, and then hormesis is another word for stress. So you're ingesting the other stress. Let's say that
yes.
that compound had to, that mushroom or that whatever had to endure in order to survive.
Yeah, and maybe turmeric and spices like cayenne are a more vivid example of that. Is like you're actually ingesting pain. So like think of having a hot pepper and you're sweating and you're uncomfortable, but actually like through that workout, you actually come out stronger in the end. So that's how a lot of the adaptogens, be it plants or fungi, work, is they actually are stress, which sounds really counterintuitive.
Which is just like what exercise is.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you've had Dr. Gondry talks about lectins, but like in a way, those lectins, when they're properly prepared, are stressors. In small dose, they actually make your body stronger. So completely avoiding a food group is actually quite dangerous. And there might be a time and place for certain healing to happen, but like completely removing these groups is kind of dangerous because the whole point is to stress the body. And what happens in the case of these fungi and, these various illnesses is that they provide the good stressors. And in this case, the impact might be that your hyperactive immune response flare up calms down and your body gets like, oh, this is the type of action. Like it reteaches the internal security officers to know who to attack and who not to attack.
I really love what you're saying because I think that this is a larger conversation or a broader conversation around the adaptations that happen to a stress. Not all stress is bad. Like this is something that I've talked about a lot because we'll call it the online expert world, everyone's like, stress is bad. Stress is always bad. It's like, no, stress is not always bad. Stress forges strength and grit and mental clarity and cellular clarity and cellular grit. I think that it's very, very important in our temperature controlled, world where it's always 72 degrees, and maybe if you're in Austin, which I know Texans, man, they love their air conditioning. So do Floridians, holy Hannah. But yes, like you're always in this temperature controlled 72 degrees, let's say, environment where we spend 90 to 95% of our time indoors, that it would behoove us to maybe get a little uncomfortable, like the cayenne or the turmeric and the black pepper. Example. I remember once I went for Indian, like at an authentic Indian restaurant with my friends who were both, from she was from Sri Lanka and he was from India proper, and they were just having like the Vindu like it was nothing. And literally me sitting next to her, I was sweating, and I had like the white version butter chicken. Like they were like, oh, there's like a white girl here. Let's just give her the butter chicken so we don't get sued. But even me sitting next to her, she was having like the Vindaloo, whatever she was having, like the super hot, whatever. I was sweating sitting next to her. Like I had yogurt as a profile, like just in case, because it was so hot. But I think that those type of stressors, like, temperature, adaptogens from chaga and all the, what we're talking about here today, exercise, I think all of these actually make us stronger. And yes, you're going to be uncomfortable maybe in the interim, but it's an acute discomfort that forges grit over the long term.
Yeah, it's something people don't want to talk about because it shows the downfall of, modern lifestyle. But like, for example, in concentration camps, happened to be that certain illnesses such as cancer didn't really exist because they were in constant caloric deficit. Now other issues emerged, but because it was so extreme. Right. Similarly, India, like whoever's been to India, how much there's cow poop everywhere and sanitation and all kinds of issues. But the high consumption of exposure on your skin to toxins combined with high exposure of various spices combined with ghee, for example, is actually like quite powerful. And there's people who are in many ways less privileged that actually live a healthier lifestyle. And that's why like America uses more food on pharmaceuticals, but the least more money on pharmaceuticals than any other country in the world, and least per capita on food. And I think it shows in just like life expectancy, which is now plateauing and coming down in the last few years. So I think that's just going to happen. And hormonal health, reproduction numbers you've covered, but like
God, those numbers are scary.
Yeah, it's like people like global population, I don't know, has it peaked yet, but it's about to peak. And a lot of people will be unable to have children, and they will get sick easier. And that's a lot because they haven't, it's like tough times create tough people create good times, and good times create weak people, and weak people create bad times. And it's this circle. And so if you can help yourself is whatever it is, like exercise, spices, adaptogens, ice bath, like having those, introducing those in a conscious way is probably temperature changes. It all tends to make the body much stronger.
Yeah. Yeah. There's, I think it's like in the last 50 years, testosterone levels, or am I messing it up now? Oh no, I think it's sperm count. Sperm count has gone down by 50%. And everybody listening to this show knows someone who has had trouble conceiving, either getting pregnant, staying pregnant. And of course, we often will blame the woman, which is like an entirely different conversation. And sometimes it is the woman, but a lot of times it's the testosterone levels and the sperm quality.
So purely scientifically, it's way more the men's fault, purely scientifically. But one of the reasons of that is that a lot of the female reproduction numbers have not been tracked until as of recently. So there was a long gap on where
the bias in reporting.
There was no reporting because it was such a taboo. Maybe socially women get guilted more, but purely from a scientific point of view, it's pretty bulletproof that men's reproduction is real downhill. And then with women, the jury's out because we don't have the data for such a long time yet. So,
So in terms of adaptogens, let's talk a little bit about adaptogens for sexual health and libido. One of the things I wanted to talk about specifically was my perimenopausal and menopausal women. One of the things I often recommend is Panax ginseng. Now, of course, there's, you have the red and the white and all that. But are there adaptogens? We've talked about cordyceps with the libido. We saw the yaks and they were getting very excited, and then the Sherpas. Are there other adaptogens that we might consider that might augment or improve sexual function, libido, and have a balancing effect, let's say, on hormones? Yeah,
there is. And I would split it into two groups. There are ones that are very clearly endocrine and circulatory focused. You mentioned two of them, cordyceps and ginseng, and we can talk about the colors in a bit. There are a few others that kind of do it somewhat similarly. I would probably put maca in that group as well.
Yeah.
Although there's much more studies on other adaptogens, but it, just in the Andes was less documented. But I would put maca in that group as well. And I think those are interesting ones. The other ones are more like people who are very high stress. Imagine like losing the V card and you're nervous and then you can't perform because you're nervous. That also happens with adults because in this case, you're nervous about something else, stressed about finance or family or kids or whatever it is. But that same nervousness impacts libido a lot. So things that could be helpful there, ashwagandha that we mentioned. Mucuna is used in a lot of like libido focused formulations because it has precursor to dopamine, L-dopa. And then a lot of people find that. And then one of the most underrated is cacao, is real cacao that combine maybe with a few of these things and vanilla and things like that. But those are things that can help the mental and the stress response, the mood element of performance. And then through that, you're able to perform better. So I would split those two. One is more of a holistic and the one is more structural. The Chinese would call it Jing and Shen. but there's slightly differences. So if you're stressed, not happy, not in the mood, literally people say, I'm not in the mood, it tends to focus more, I would say, the ashwagandha, the mucuna, the cacao. And then if you're, hey, I'm in the mood, I need to get more oomph, is ginseng, cordyceps, type of things.
So let's talk about ginseng and some of the different colors. Often red is often I often, if I am going to counsel someone to pick up ginseng, it's going to be the red ginseng. It's usually a perimenopausal or menopausal woman that I'm telling to do that. Talk a little bit about the different colors and what they mean in terms of, I know that there's black as well. So talk about how those are all different and what we might look out for as consumers.
Yeah, besides turmeric and cacao, probably ginseng is the most household herb and also the most household adaptogen. The good news is that it is amazing, and there's so much studies, like along with reishi, it's the most studied of these adaptogens. Negative is there's a lot of marketing hype. You can go to a gas station and buy a pill for this purpose that is said to have ginseng. There's also a lot of marketing, like ashwagandha is called Indian ginseng, maca is called Peruvian ginseng, rhodiola is called the Nordic ginseng. None of these are ginsengs. There is kind of like three main forms of ginseng. The most studied is the Asian ginseng or the Korean ginseng. It's Panax ginseng is the Latin name. And it comes in a few colors. Then there's an American ginseng, and then there's another ginseng. What's interesting to me is while adaptogens are safe and for everyone, there is still elements of our body, and that's differences with age, genetics, and gender that can impact, for example, temperature. And I think that's for this purpose, a really relevant one. So for example, the classic example is the guy is constantly hot, sleeping, and then the woman is cold, right? So that means their bodies are hot and cold. And then when the hormonal shift happens, tends to flip-flop, right? Men start to get like constantly cold, and then women start to heat up, right? So there's even a time element. So the red ginseng and the Panax ginseng tends to be more heating. So actually, like it's better usually for women like under 40, under 45. And I would actually not recommend it to guys until they are at least active use, depending on the body type and lifestyle. But for most men, it's actually better when they age and then help boost testosterone at an older age. Versus the American ginseng is much more cooling. So like it might be the opposite for women. So maybe you're on the right Panax ginseng earlier on. But these are very individual. These are very broad stroke generic comments, because they're for every guy who's hot all the time, we can find a guy who's cold. So it's individual. But from a generic point of view, there's a lot of ginsengs that are not ginsengs. And then the type of ginseng matters to what your goals are. And then finally, you want to buy a ginseng that is at least a few years old, ideally 6 to 7 years old. So it's basically like these bugs biting on the roots of the ginseng, and that's what you're consuming is the root in this case. So different plants, you use the leaf or the fruit or the whatever. In this case, you use the root, and the bugs biting on the ginseng root actually increase like the compounds that we're trying to benefit from, like the ginsenoside. So there is an element of like, if you pick a too young of a ginseng, it doesn't have these compounds yet that you're trying to seek. Therefore, it has to be old enough, the ginseng, to have enough of stressors itself to be able to help with our health benefits. So, not all products are created equal, which is pretty obvious, but in the supplement biohacking world, that quality factor often gets ignored, or it's ignored by some marketing message saying that this is the best ginseng in the world, which is,
or we're calling things ginseng that aren't even ginseng.
Yes, it's very common.
Crazy. Yeah.
For example, with reishi, I don't know the ginseng statistics, but there was a study, USB study that was published in Science about the reishi supplements sold in the US, and 74% of the reishi supplements in the US didn't include any reishi mushroom. So that happens.
It really is the wild, wild west. You really do have to be careful and understand the company who you're buying from. Like if you're buying it, as you mentioned, from the gas station, the likelihood of it being a quality source of reishi or ginseng or whatever is going to be low.
Yeah. It is. But it's also like not every TikTok, Instagram brand is any better. It's like it could also be weirdly like Costco, I know, has one of the highest quality standards on whatever you sell. So like it might be surprising also where you find like authentic products in a way.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any recommendations for consumers in terms of how and you can plug your company if you'd like. Shameless plug, but I love, and I'll say I love the products that Four Sigmatic puts out. I think that they're you don't put too many things in it. I can feel like for example, when I take the lion's mane mushroom coffee, like I do feel a lift. I feel like my brain is very much firing on all cylinders, which is really lovely, especially when I need to perform, like podcasts like this. But is there a way that we can, let's say, if we want to be smarter consumers of adaptogenic products, are there any guidelines or guideposts that you might have? Like one of the things I always say, if it says proprietary blend on it, don't buy it. Like I hate people that put that on the label because that, for me, that just, it's like you're hiding your work. I like people to show their work. I want to know exactly what's in the product. So are there any other guideposts that you might suggest for people when they're looking to buy adaptogens?
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, Healing Adaptogens, because it was like, I wish this book would have existed 10, 20 years ago when I was starting and trying to learn this. And I wanted to write a book that is relevant for many years to come and decades to come. And, brands change. Like a brand could be good for a while and then it's not, right?
Right.
So kind of 5 key things to consider. And this is true not just for adaptogens, but pretty much all natural products. One is the genus, like, is it really ginseng or is it what it says it is? So that's one. Second is the part. All these supplement facts panels should say if they're using the leaf, the root, the whatever. And in the book, I explain what part you should be using. So that's important. And then the dose. So that's important, is like, are you getting enough? And like, again, like if you're getting 80 in a small scoop, 80 of these adaptogens, you're probably not getting any, or 75, you're not getting any. So like, it's called pixie dusting in the industry. So by putting a little bit on the label, you can claim that you have it in the product. Let alone, by the way, there can be a 20% delta. So you can be 20% off according to FDA allows for you to have a mistake on your label, which is also insane. Purity.
That is insane. Yeah.
So once you know that you're getting the right thing, are you getting it enough of the thing? Are you getting a form that is bioavailable? And that's different for different products. And then, is it pure? So while certified organic is not bulletproof, it usually guarantees a lot of things, including with these products. So having a non-organic product, and there's all these companies that say they're like beyond organic, or that organic is really expensive. Like organic is a few $100. So a year, depending on those expectations. So it's just also like, if it's organic, why wouldn't you put it on the label and get credit for it? Like if you buy organic and don't put it on the label, isn't it real weird? Like you're going all the work, but you're not getting the credit for it. So
right.
Yeah, I think there's also sustainability factors with some adaptogens, but yeah, generally I would say focus on the genus, the form. Is it bioavailable? Is there enough of it? Is it pure?
And I wanted to, I know we've been talking about functional mushrooms and adaptogens for our conversation. We talked a little bit about culinary mushrooms. I also didn't want to leave this conversation without talking about psychedelic mushrooms as well, because this has been, I've talked publicly about my own sort of therapy with, we'll call it not mushrooms, but let's say other classes of drugs in my own healing journey, like MDMA. But I've also had some beautiful experiences with mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms, that is. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to, I've heard you tell the story, and I listened to it so many times in preparation for our conversation. I wanted you to share it with my audience around the origins, the potential psychedelic origins of our story of Santa Claus. And then maybe we can move into a conversation around psychedelics themselves.
Yeah. Well, very long story short, Santa Claus, which is arguably the most famous person in the world, known beyond any religion or culture, is actually one of the most misunderstood stories, which is not uncommon. A lot of the holidays or holy days that we celebrate have some sort of unique heritage that we've forgotten, be it Easter, fertility.
Or they borrowed it from other, like pagan, yes.
Yeah, pagan roots, but also like over time, the story has shifted. So like, it's like a game of telephone. Like you tell your friend who tells a friend who tells a friend, and the story changes. So it's funny that today, this like world's most famous person is promoting sugar water and commercial consumerism, where the origin of it is around death and psychedelics. So long story short, like the version of Santa Claus we know today is from New York, or New Amsterdam, as it was called. It was brought there by the Dutch. They have this character called Santa Claus. Santa Claus was stolen from the Germans. A lot of people think Saint Nicholas is German. It's actually Turkish. So the Germans got their tradition from the Italians. Italians stole the grape from Turkey. So it was a time when this kind of like pagan story was Christianized and combined with this Turkish bishop, Saint Nicholas. But there's no reindeers in Turkey. And if you start to track back, pretty much all the Slavic people way before Saint Nicholas, even today, are celebrating this Father Frost, Dead Moros. So even if you talk to your friends in Ukraine or Russia or wherever today, they don't celebrate Santa Claus. But a character who's identical to Santa Claus, pretty much, but it's a different story, and it's much older. And the Russians got it from the last indigenous culture left in Europe, called the Sami, that have been around for 8,000 to 10,000 years. So if the Ice Age ended, call it 11,000, 13,000 years ago, right after the Sami's been around. They're in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and parts of Russia, and they're semi-nomadic reindeer herders. So here comes the reindeers. It's the area where reindeers are. So it's the native, and they celebrate very along with nature. And this is an area where in the summer, there is no night at all, 24 hours of sunlight. And then in the winter, it's pretty much almost full day of darkness. So winter solstice is the original time of winter solstice aligns with Christmas. There was a shift in calendars.
Correct. Yeah.
And now
that's
it's like
3 days as well, right? I think that but that's maybe more of a historical, more of a religious conversation, but yeah.
The Julian and Gregorian calendar shifted, but it was like winter solstice, and they would host a ceremony, and Santa Claus, which is actually a shaman, would go from village to village to do the ceremonies. Reindeer are the domesticated mammal to go in the snow and go to these teepees that are called kota. And they're like a big teepee, and there's a hole at the top, and it often snows a lot in this winter time, and you get snowed in. So your secondary entrance is through the chimney in the kota. You can climb up and come down, and they would come with a sack of gifts, and they would do a ceremony of a psychedelic called Amanita muscaria. It's the most famous mushroom in the whole world, while nobody really knows its name. It's the one mushroom emoji on your phone. It's the one that Super Mario eats and gets bigger. It's the one on old Disney movies. Mm-hmm. It's everywhere, but you don't know. But it's actually a legal psychedelic in all but one state in the US. Legal? Yeah, it's legal. It grows pretty much in every country in the world. It grows under the Christmas tree, the spruce. So if you go to Rockefeller Center in New York or wherever, you have a Norwegian spruce tree. And from the roots in harmony grows this Amanita, where like under the Christmas trees where you have the gifts. And in the fall time around September, the shaman would have gone under the Christmas tree to pick up the first Christmas presents and then dry them over a fire, like a sock type of
like a stocking kind of.
Yeah, stocking to dry it so it doesn't get mold. And then it would ingest it, the psychedelic in the winter, and then reindeers would fly and other dreams would come. And there's a whole story of the mythology of like why they go and they talk to ancestors. But it's really beautiful. It's about family.
Why do they go and talk to ancestors?
For wisdom. So there's a lot of like lessons. So again, it's probably a longer conversation about philosophy, animism, and like what is God and who is God and what are spirits. And it's somewhat different from our
And
Western.
reverence for the dead.
Yes.
Which I think is not discussed at all in North American society.
And they did it yearly. So this Midsummer, which is No Night, is a fertility festival. And the whole point is about birth. So the whole point is about fertility and new beginnings and birth. And then Winter, which is Christmas, is about death and remembering death and this cycle. And actually psychedelics often remind you of both, either universal love or about like getting comfortable with the fact that we're all going to die, and the people we cared most or care most about have died or will die, and processing that knowledge is really valuable. So that's really,
yeah. I mean,
that's the Santa Claus story.
That's the elevator pitch for why the commercial holiday today is not really what it seems. It always seemed a bit weird. I was like, why is there a big red suit, reindeers, and Jesus, and this all at the same time? And I've you know, I don't really talk too much about this publicly because, of course, it's going to offend someone somewhere, and you know, I don't necessarily want to do that. But yeah, a lot of the things that we view as Christianity are actually borrowed from, you know, Isis is the analog to Mary, and Horus the sun analog to Jesus, and all of these different things. And one of the things that I've been thinking about more, and this might be me in my old age, but or as I'm kind of coming into my own in my 40s, is I think about death more and more, not in a morbid way, but as a reminder that nothing is promised. Like nothing, like I could not wake up tomorrow, or something traumatic could happen, or, you know, like all that is right now, it's important to be present to what is, because at some point it's not going to be here anymore. And I think that the way that you know, Instagram and society as a whole is really scared of death, is really scared of aging. I mean, you see this, like women, we are taught that if once we, you know, past 40, it's like you're, you know, you're not fertile anymore, or you're not, you know, you're washed up, or you're not important anymore. So I think that there's this lack of reverence for our elders and our well-lived family members, friends, counsel, who have a lot more to say because they've had the experiences that we haven't yet. But we lock them up in nursing homes, and we don't want to see their decaying bodies, let's say, or their decrepit, you know, the skin that's sagging, or the diseases that they have. And I think that there are many societies. It sounds like you've had some exposure to this, but there are many societies that do talk about death all the time, so that they remind themselves to live, because everybody lives, right? Everyone's going to die, but not everybody lives, right? Or, you know, something, the saying goes something like that.
Yeah, for sure. It's like memento mori is obviously the famous Latin, but like remembering that you're going to die is giving gratitude and joy for today that you're living. So, you know, we're all going to die. One day that's going to be true. It's just remembering to live.
Yes. Well said. So with psychedelics, or with mushrooms, let's say, I've had some, I don't know if I would classify them as shaman, but I'll say guides, say that it's important to get familiar with these types of trips, let's say, several times a year. Is there any thinking or opinions that you may have, you know, either through your own experience or others that you've spoken with, in terms of the usefulness of psychedelics, how often that might be useful in someone's healing journey? And of course, again, it depends. I understand that there's like a different journey. We all come from different environments. We have different upbringings. But one of the things that I've come to understand is that we're all more alike than we are different, right? So even something that, even though we may have had different upbringings or different environments that we grew up in, we all want, at least to some degree, the same thing. We want to be loved. We want to be seen. We want to be understood. We want to be heard. by someone. Is there any, in terms of psychedelic use and even specific types, that you would say that have been particularly useful for you or people that you've spoken to?
Yeah. So when we talk about psychedelic mushrooms, we usually talk about various psilocybin varieties, not so much the Amanita, for a good reason. I should have said that in the Santa Claus story. I do not recommend that psychedelic. While legal, you should not probably try it. Like, it's really like for very few people. Let's just put it this way, for various reasons. But the psilocybin tends to be incredibly safe and completely like non-addictive. There is no overdose. And the research on it is overwhelmingly positive. About 2/3 of people using it will have profound results for different things, from like quitting smoking to depression to other positive impacts. And more studies are coming up. Unfortunately, there was a big war on drugs, so it's been left behind. With psychedelics, there is a risk that the pendulum swings from extreme no to extreme yes. And I'll kind of start to see that. Particularly with psilocybin, I'm pretty worried about like microdosing. I don't really believe as much, or at least how it's subscribed. If you build tolerance, there's a serotonin receptor with psilocybin, and you build tolerance, and how people microdose is not really the thing, how it works. And I'm actually a much believer of macrodosing or heroic doses, very high dosage, few times in your life, or at least not like every month. And it is hilarious, even with things like ayahuasca. I met this real shaman who started the shaman training at the age of 3. A lot of these people, these healers, were very sick as a baby, and that's how they were chosen to the training. And she was in something in her 50s, and she was like talking of working with the mother ayahuasca, and said she has a lot of experience over the last many decades of working with it, and she's taken it as many as 12 times. And in the audience was a lot of like community members who were pro psychedelics, and probably more than half the room had taken it more than 12 times. And she's like a professional shaman. So I think there's a real potential issue on abuse, but overall they are very safe. Particularly psilocybin is very safe, and more often than not offers positive impact. But what I would encourage people to do is finding a larger dose less often and enough time to truly integrate whatever is coming out of it, and then prepare for the next one. So,
and the setting, I think, is really important too.
Yes.
Like, what are you doing going into it? It's not like you're at a party with 100 people that you don't know. Like, it's a sacred space, and there's an intention around healing, and there's an intention around getting to know yourself in all the dimensions that you are.
Set and setting, and then the proper integration after. And that integration could take many months, honestly, like depending on various factors, sometimes a whole year. So like taking them one time a year might be a better idea than taking them every month. But again, everybody for their own. I'm a huge proponent of, for all these things, is freedom and everybody choosing for their own. I would just word of caution, both from a scientific literature today, but also from experiencing many people in my life who've gone from absolute no to drugs to yes to everything. And usually the answer is somewhere in the middle, right? And it's an interesting journey, and I find more promise with psychedelics than almost anything else for society, consciousness, and humanity. And I fundamentally think we're kind of screwed as humanity unless we do a corrective action towards better in many forms of life. But I think human consciousness is kind of one of those key factors, and this is one of the most profound ways to shift human consciousness. So I'm a huge proponent of psychedelics, but there is this disclaimer, and I'm somewhat worried about the next few years of what's coming down the pipe. But maybe it's still better than the alternative. So I'm here for all of it.
Right. I love that. Thank you so much. Tero, this has been so wonderful. If people want to learn more about you, about your company, please tell them where they can find you. Are you on social media, websites, podcast and of course I'll have links to some of the products that I love in the show notes as well. But please tell people where they can interact more with you if they want to find out more about your work.
Yeah, I'm really bad with social media, honestly. I'm on Instagram at I am Tero, Tero, posting subpar average content plus cute photos of my family. And
way to sell it.
Yeah. And then Four Sigmatic posts premium content. So Four Sigmatic at all channels. So I just took a 6-month hiatus off of Instagram, which is the only social media I use. And now I've been actively using and trying to learn how to use it. And I sometimes laugh at my own content. It's like, who cares? But anyway, find me on Instagram or and all social channels through Four Sigmatic, and we'll put out content. And then if you want, read one of my books. I have one on the Santa Claus and Amanita. It's a children's book. I have one book on mushrooms, one book on adaptogens coming up. So you can find those wherever books are sold, bookstores and Amazon and whatnot.
Amazing. I will put links for all of that. Tero, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your wisdom today. I know it's going to be very valuable to my audience, and I really enjoyed having this conversation with you.
Thanks for having me on. It was a blast.
All right. If you enjoyed that conversation, you are going to love the next video that I have queued up for you. We are going to be talking about eating for energy, mental clarity, and weight loss. It's right there.
Manufacturers feed us so many lies, and it's not just the manufacturers. The government is telling us to do that because the government is lobbied by the manufacturers.